The small-town cafe buzzed with the usual morning chatter. Locals gathered in their favorite spots, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mixing with the scent of warm pastries. A couple of elderly men played a quiet game of checkers near the window, while the waitress darted between tables, balancing plates of scrambled eggs and toast. Outside, the streets of Meadow Creek lay calm and familiar, lined with flower boxes and old brick buildings that had weathered decades of change. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, and most days passed without incident. At a corner table, near a wall lined with faded photographs of the town's history, sat a man in his 60s. He stirred his black coffee slowly, his movements steady and deliberate. He was unremarkable to the untrained eye: worn jeans, a flannel shirt, and a weathered face framed by silver hair that shimmered faintly in the morning sunlight. His presence didn't draw attention. Most patrons barely noticed him as they carried on with their small-town routines. But if anyone looked closely, they might have caught the sharpness in his eyes, hidden behind a pair of modest, wire-rimmed glasses. Those eyes had seen things most people couldn't imagine. They had observed lies unraveling, threats neutralized, and justice served in ways both lawful and necessary. To most of the town, he was just Jim. Jim Morgan, the quiet man who retired years ago, blending seamlessly into the fabric of Meadow Creek. He was a farmer now, or so they believed. He spent his days tending a small patch of land on the outskirts of town, fixing fences, and occasionally dropping by the cafe for a cup of coffee. What they didn't know, what no one here truly understood, was that Jim had once been much more than the friendly farmer. Before he came to Meadow Creek, he was Sheriff James Morgan, a name that carried weight in law enforcement circles. Back then, his reputation had been legendary. Criminals who heard his name would often surrender without a fight, knowing the alternative was a confrontation they wouldn't win. His hands, now steady on a simple coffee cup, had once wielded justice with precision. His voice, calm and measured, had once diffused tense standoffs that could have turned deadly. And his mind, still sharp as ever, had pieced together puzzles that others thought unsolvable. But that was another life. One Jim had left behind when he traded his badge for the quiet rhythms of Meadow Creek. Jim wasn't running from anything, though some might think so. He wasn't hiding either. His decision to leave the sheriff's office hadn't been driven by fear or regret. It was exhaustion. Years of facing humanity's darkest sides: violence, betrayal, desperation had taken their toll. He had seen too much, done too much, and lost too much. When the chance came to retire, he took it without hesitation. He packed his life into a single pickup truck and drove until the sprawling cities gave way to rolling hills and open skies. He'd stumbled upon Meadow Creek almost by accident, but it felt like fate. For a man who had spent his life standing in the line of fire, Meadow Creek was a sanctuary. Here, the loudest noises were the church bells on Sunday or the chatter at the farmer's market. People were kind, and the world moved at a slower pace. It was exactly what Jim needed. But peace is a fragile thing. This morning seemed no different from any other. The cafe hummed with life, a small bubble of warmth against the crisp autumn air outside. Jim kept to himself, listening to the soft clinking of cups and forks, the occasional laugh from a nearby table. He liked being invisible here, blending into the background. It gave him space to think, to reflect, to simply exist without the weight of expectations or danger. His gaze drifted to the photos on the wall. They told the story of Meadow Creek: black and white images of the first general store, a parade from the 1950s, a group of school children planting trees. One picture caught his attention, as it always did: the town's old sheriff, standing proudly in his uniform, flanked by deputies. Sheriff Douglas had retired long before Jim arrived, but he often wondered what kind of man Douglas had been. Did he know the weight of the badge? The way it never quite left your shoulders, even after you took it off? Jim shook the thought away and took another sip of his coffee. He wasn't Sheriff Morgan anymore. He reminded himself of that every day. Yet, even in a town as peaceful as Meadow Creek, there were moments when his instincts, honed over decades, would stir. He couldn't turn them off completely. The small things, a glance exchanged between strangers, a nervous laugh, the way someone's hands fidgeted, would catch his attention. Most of the time, it was nothing. Just people being people. But every now and then, his gut would tighten, a faint signal that something wasn't quite right. He had learned to trust that feeling. This morning, however, everything seemed fine. Ordinary. Calm. At least, it did, until the rumble of motorcycles broke the tranquility. It started as a distant growl, faint but unmistakable, growing louder with each passing second. Heads turned toward the windows as the noise drew closer, the sound vibrating through the cafe's walls. The locals exchanged uneasy glances. Motorcycles weren't unusual, but this was different. The sound wasn't just one or two bikes, it was a pack. Jim set his coffee cup down, his movements as deliberate as ever. He didn't look toward the window like everyone else. Instead, he focused on his breathing, the subtle tension creeping into his shoulders. The growling engine stopped abruptly as the bikes pulled into the cafe's gravel lot. 7 of them. Jim could tell by the distinct patterns of the engines as they idled. He could also tell by the way the cafe fell silent that these weren't locals. The door swung open, and the air shifted. The usual warmth of the cafe gave way to something colder, heavier. A group of bikers walked in, their boots thudding against the worn wooden floor. Leather jackets, chains, and tattoos made them stand out like wolves in a room full of sheep. Jim didn't move. He didn't need to. From his corner, he could see everything: their postures, their faces, the way their eyes scanned the room like predators sizing up prey. The leader, a towering man with a jagged scar running down his cheek, stepped forward, his boots leaving faint marks on the floor. The chatter in the cafe died completely. The waitress froze mid-step, clutching a tray of coffee mugs. Even the old men by the window stopped their game, their hands hovering over the checkers board. The leader's voice boomed, breaking the tense silence. "What's a guy gotta do to get some service around here?" His gang laughed, a sound that echoed off the walls like a threat. Jim adjusted his glasses, his expression calm. He didn't need to say anything, not yet. For now, he would watch. But deep down, he already knew, peace, once again, was about to be tested. Jim sat quietly in his corner, his hands resting on the edge of the small, round table. His coffee, still warm, sent a faint wisp of steam curling upward. He didn't need to glance up to feel the shift in the air. Years of experience had trained him to sense trouble before it fully arrived. Trouble, he'd learned, rarely came quietly, and today's trouble had roared in on 7 motorcycles. The leader, the one with the jagged scar that seemed to cut across his face like a warning sign, sauntered further into the cafe. His leather jacket was adorned with patches that meant nothing to the locals but spoke volumes to someone like Jim. The patches weren't decorative, they were marks of rank, loyalty, and deeds, some of which were better left unspoken. Jim's eyes flicked briefly to the leader's right hand, which bore a faded tattoo of a serpent coiled around a dagger. That, too, told its own story. The gang spread out, claiming the room like it was theirs. One leaned against the counter, picking up a napkin holder and flipping it idly between his hands. Another slid into a booth, sprawling out as though he were in his own living room. 2 more stood near the door, keeping an eye on the bikes parked outside. Their leader took his time, his boots scuffing against the floor with each step. He looked around slowly, as if daring anyone to make eye contact. No one did. The young waitress, barely out of high school, stood frozen near the counter. She clutched a tray of coffee mugs so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The leader noticed her hesitation and smirked. He gestured lazily at the tray. "How about you bring those over here, sweetheart?" His voice was loud, oily, and full of a confidence that came from knowing no one would challenge him. She didn't move. I said, the leader repeated, his voice hardening, bring em over. Behind the counter, the cafe owner, a balding man in his 50s named Ray, stepped forward. His apron was stained with grease from the morning's cooking, but his face was pale. She'll get to you in a minute, Ray said, trying to keep his voice steady. The leader's smirk widened into a grin that showed too many teeth. Well, look at that. The man in the apron speaks. He leaned on the counter, his bulk making the polished wood creak. Let me tell you how this is gonna work, buddy. You're gonna treat us real nice. That means the girl here does what she's told, and you, he reached across the counter, snatching a sugar packet and tearing it open with exaggerated care. You keep that coffee flowing. Got it? Ray hesitated, his gaze flicking toward the other customers. Most of them were staring down at their plates or phones, doing their best to pretend they weren't there. Jim was the exception. He still hadn't moved, but his eyes sharp and steady had locked onto the scene unfolding before him. The leader noticed Jim then. His grin faltered for half a second, replaced by a flicker of something else. Curiosity? Wariness? Whatever it was, it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. He straightened up, brushing the sugar packet off the counter. And what about you, Grandpa? He called out, his tone dripping with mockery. You just gonna sit there and sip your coffee while the grown UPS talk? The cafe fell silent again. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed to fade. Jim lifted his coffee cup and took a slow sip. Then, just as deliberately, he set it back down. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and even. Coffee's not bad here, he said, ignoring the taunt. You should try it. Might help with that attitude of yours. A few people gasped quietly, their heads jerking up in surprise. The leader's grin disappeared entirely. He took a step toward Jim's table, his boots heavy against the wooden floor. You've got a mouth on you for an old man, he said, his tone darkening. Jim leaned back in his chair, his hands resting lightly on the table's edge. He met the leader's glare with an unflinching gaze. You've got a lot of noise in you for someone who doesn't belong here, he replied evenly. The leader stopped, his face twitching with irritation. His gang, sensing the shift in mood, straightened up. One of them, a wiry man with a snake tattoo winding up his arm, stepped closer. You want us to teach him some respect, boss? He asked eagerly. Jim's gaze shifted briefly to the wiry man, then back to the leader. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The leader held up a hand, stopping his gang in their tracks. Not yet, he said, his voice low. He stared at Jim for a long moment, as if trying to size him up. You've got guts, I'll give you that, he said finally. But guts'll only get you so far. Jim didn't respond. He simply picked up his coffee and took another sip. The leader chuckled, though there was no humor in the sound. You keep drinking that coffee, old man, he said. But don't think for a second we're done here. With that, he turned back to the counter, barking orders at Ray for food and coffee. The waitress, still trembling, hurried to fill their mugs and bring out plates of scrambled eggs and bacon. The bikers ate noisily, their laughter and crude jokes filling the cafe. But Jim knew this wasn't over. He had seen men like this before. Bullies who thrived on fear and intimidation. They didn't stop until someone stopped them. And while Meadow Creek was a quiet town full of good people, it wasn't equipped to deal with trouble like this. The locals would avoid confrontation, hoping the bikers would leave on their own. Jim knew better. He glanced down at his coffee cup, now almost empty. The dark liquid reflected his face, etched with lines that spoke of experience, loss, and resolve. He hadn't come here looking for trouble. But trouble had a way of finding him, even in the quiet corners of the world. With a sigh, Jim pushed his chair back and stood. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the worn leather of his wallet and the smooth, cold surface of something else. He hesitated, then withdrew the wallet, leaving the other object untouched. Not yet. As he walked toward the counter, the leader glanced up, his eyes narrowing. "You got a problem, old man?" he asked, his voice full of challenge. Jim stopped a few feet away, his expression unreadable. "Just here to pay my bill," he said calmly. The leader snorted, leaning back in his chair. "Good idea. Wouldn't want you running out on your tab." Jim handed Ray a $20 bill, nodding toward the waitress. "Keep the change," he said. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the cafe, the bell above the door jingling softly as it closed behind him. Outside, the morning sun was bright, casting long shadows across the gravel lot. Jim stood by his truck, his hand resting on the driver's side door. He looked back at the cafe, his sharp eyes narrowing as he watched the gang through the window. They were trouble, all right. But they didn't know just how much trouble they were about to face. Because while Jim Morgan had traded his badge for a quieter life, he hadn't forgotten what it meant to stand up for what was right. And if these bikers thought they could terrorize Meadow Creek without consequences, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The cafe's quiet hum turned into an uneasy silence as the rumble of motorcycle engines filled the air. 7 bikers roared into the gravel parking lot, their bikes gleaming under the late morning sun. The sound was jarring, loud, aggressive, and unmistakably out of place in the sleepy town of Meadow Creek. Heads turned toward the windows as the bikes came to a halt in a chaotic line. Clad in worn leather jackets decorated with patches and symbols, the riders dismounted with an air of practiced confidence. Their boots hit the ground hard, kicking up dust that swirled around their legs. They moved with the deliberate swagger of men who expected to own any room they entered. The leader was the first to step inside. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and had a jagged scar slicing diagonally across his face, a permanent mark that seemed to sneer along with him. His presence alone was enough to make people shrink into their seats. He didn't glance around to see who might be watching, he knew everyone was. The small bell above the door jingled as the rest of the gang filed in behind him. They spread out like wolves surveying their territory. One leaned lazily against the counter, his arms crossed. Another dragged a chair out from a table, the legs scraping loudly against the wooden floor, and plopped down with a smug grin. "Coffee," the leader barked, his deep voice cutting through the silence. "And make it quick." The young waitress behind the counter froze, her wide eyes darting nervously between the bikers. She couldn't have been older than 19, her ponytail swinging slightly as she fumbled to pick up the pot of coffee. Her hands trembled, causing the mugs on her tray to clink together. "What's the holdup?" the leader growled, slamming his palm flat on the counter. The sound made her jump, nearly spilling the coffee. From the kitchen, Ray, the cafe owner, peeked out, his face pale. He wiped his hands nervously on his stained apron before stepping out to the front. Everything all right here?" he asked cautiously, his voice shaky but polite. The leader turned his cold gaze toward Ray. "You the boss?" Ray hesitated before nodding. "Good," the leader said with a smirk. "Then you'll make sure we get what we need. And fast. We don't like to wait." "Yes, of course," Ray stammered. He motioned for the waitress to hurry up. "Jenna, go on, get them what they want." Jenna nodded quickly, pouring coffee into a row of mugs, her hands still trembling. The other patrons stayed glued to their seats, avoiding eye contact. Conversations had ceased completely, and even the clink of forks on plates had stopped. No one wanted to draw attention to themselves. Jim, however, remained calm. Seated at his corner table, he stirred his coffee with steady hands. His sharp eyes watched everything unfold, though his face betrayed no emotion. One of the bikers, a wiry man with a snake tattoo coiling up his neck, noticed Jim sitting there. He sauntered over, his boots thudding heavily on the floor. He stopped just short of Jim's table, looking down at the older man with a smirk. "Well, well. Looks like we got ourselves a tough guy," the biker said, loud enough for everyone to hear. His grin widened when Jim didn't respond. "What's the matter, old man? Cat got your tongue?" Jim didn't look up. He simply stirred his coffee one last time, then set the spoon down beside the cup with deliberate precision. The biker leaned closer, placing a hand on the edge of the table. "I said, you got a problem?" he asked, his voice dripping with mockery. Jim finally glanced up, his expression unreadable. "Not at all," he said quietly. The biker blinked, caught off guard by the calm response. For a moment, he seemed unsure of what to say. Then he laughed, straightening up and turning to the rest of the gang. "Hey, Scar, you see this? Grandpa thinks he's too good to talk to us." The leader, who had been leaning against the counter watching the waitress, turned his attention to Jim. His scarred face twisted into an amused smirk. "That's so," he said, his voice low and dangerous. He took a step toward Jim's table, his boots echoing loudly in the now silent cafe. The other bikers followed, forming a loose circle around Jim. The tension in the room was suffocating. "Maybe he just needs a little encouragement," the wiry biker suggested, cracking his knuckles. Jim didn't flinch. He reached for his coffee cup, lifting it to his lips and taking a slow sip. The casual gesture seemed to irritate the gang even more. The leader stopped a few feet away, crossing his arms as he studied Jim. "You got a lot of nerve sitting there like you own the place," he said, his tone challenging. "Or maybe you're just too old to know when to mind your business." Jim set the coffee cup down carefully, his eyes meeting the leader's without wavering. "I'm just here to drink my coffee," he said evenly. "Same as anyone else." The leader chuckled, though there was no humor in the sound. He leaned down slightly, his face inches from Jim's. "Let me explain something, old man. When we walk into a place, it becomes our business. Understand?" Jim didn't blink. "Loud and clear," he said, his tone as calm as ever. For a moment, the leader stared at him, his jaw tightening. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a sharp laugh, the leader straightened up. "You're a brave one, I'll give you that," he said. "Stupid, but brave." He turned back to his gang, motioning toward the counter. "All right, boys, let's eat. We'll deal with this guy later." The bikers laughed, their tension dissolving as they followed their leader's lead. They settled into the booths and bar stools, their loud voices and crude jokes filling the cafe once more. Jim watched them quietly, his expression unreadable. He didn't move, didn't say a word. But in his mind, he was already running through the possibilities. He had seen men like this before, bullies who thrived on fear and intimidation. They weren't the first, and they wouldn't be the last. But Meadow Creek was his town, and he wasn't about to let them tear it apart. The bikers claimed their space like it was a throne room. They leaned back in chairs, boots propped up on tables, and barked orders for food as if they owned the place. The waitress, Jenna, flinched with every word, her trembling hands nearly dropping plates as she served them. "Faster, sweetheart," one of the bikers sneered as she set down a stack of pancakes. He leaned in too close, his grin wolfish. "You're shaking. You scared of us? We don't bite much." Jenna swallowed hard, her face pale. She glanced at Ray, silently pleading for help, but he was busy pretending to wipe down the counter, his shoulders hunched as if trying to disappear. Jim noticed everything. He saw the way Jenna's knuckles turned white as she gripped the edge of a tray, the way Ray's hands shook as he tried to act like nothing was wrong. And he saw the smug satisfaction on the bikers' faces as they watched the fear they were spreading. He remained seated, his coffee cup now empty, but his mind was far from still. The leader, Scar, tore into his stack of pancakes, syrup dripping from his fork as he chewed noisily. He glanced around the room, his sharp eyes settling on different patrons. Most avoided his gaze, keeping their heads down and pretending to focus on their meals. But one elderly couple in the corner wasn't quick enough. "What are you looking at, old man?" Scar barked, his voice booming. The older man, dressed in a neatly pressed flannel shirt, stammered something unintelligible, his wife clutching his arm nervously. Scar slammed his fork down, the clatter making everyone jump. He stood and took a menacing step toward the couple. "I asked you a question," he said, his voice low but threatening. Jim's chair scraped softly against the floor as he stood. The sound was quiet, almost unnoticeable, but it carried enough weight to make Scar pause. "Leave them alone," Jim said simply. The cafe fell silent again, every eye turning to the corner table. Scar turned slowly, his scarred face twisting into an amused smirk. "Oh, look who decided to grow a spine," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. Jim didn't respond. He stood tall, his hands resting casually at his sides, his calm gaze locked on Scar. "You got something to say, old man?" Scar challenged, taking a step closer. "I said, leave them alone," Jim repeated, his tone steady but firm. The bikers burst into laughter, the sound loud and grating. Scar chuckled, shaking his head. "You're something else, aren't you?" he said. He gestured toward his gang. "What do you boys think? Should we teach Grandpa here a lesson?" The wiry biker with the snake tattoo stood up, cracking his knuckles. "Been itching for some fun," he said with a grin. Scar raised a hand, signaling for him to wait. He stepped closer to Jim, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. They were now just a few feet apart, the tension between them almost palpable. "You think you're some kind of hero?" Scar asked, his voice low and taunting. Jim didn't flinch. "I think this town has had enough of you." The cafe was so quiet that even the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen seemed loud. The other patrons sat frozen, their breaths held as they waited to see what would happen next. Scar's smirk widened. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts don't get you far when you're outnumbered." Jim's gaze didn't waver. "Maybe. But I've been outnumbered before." Scar's smirk faltered slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone who looked like Jim, a quiet, unassuming man who seemed more suited to rocking chairs than showdowns. "You got a death wish or something?" Scar asked, his voice louder now, his bravado returning. Jim tilted his head slightly, his expression calm. "Not today." For a moment, the two men stared each other down, the air between them crackling with unspoken tension. Then Scar laughed, throwing his head back. The sound was harsh and guttural. "You're lucky I'm in a good mood today, old man," he said, stepping back. "But don't push it. Next time, I won't be so generous." He turned to his gang, motioning for them to settle back down. "Come on, boys, let's finish up and get out of here. This place is boring me." The bikers returned to their food and banter, but the atmosphere remained tense. Jenna and Ray exchanged nervous glances, relief mingling with fear. Jim sat back down, picking up his coffee cup. It was empty, but he held it anyway, his fingers steady. He knew this wasn't over. Men like Scar didn't let challenges go unanswered. From his seat, Jim could see the reflection of the bikers in the cafe's front window. They were still laughing, still enjoying their sense of control. But Jim also saw something they didn't: a police cruiser slowly pulling into the parking lot. Deputy Hank Carlson stepped out, his uniform crisp and his face set in a frown. Hank was young, maybe in his late 20s, and still green when it came to handling real trouble. He adjusted his belt as he walked into the cafe, his eyes scanning the room. The bikers noticed him immediately, their laughter fading. Scar leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting to one of mild amusement. Well, he said, gesturing toward Hank. Looks like the cavalry's here. Hank approached cautiously, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. Morning, folks, he said, his voice steady but not entirely confident. Everything all right here? Better than ever, Scar said with a grin. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. You here to join us for breakfast, officer? Hank's eyes darted toward Jim, who gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. Taking a deep breath, Hank turned back to Scar. We've had some complaints about noise and disruption, he said firmly. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Scar's grin widened, his teeth flashing. Complaints, huh? Well, we wouldn't want to upset the fine folks of Meadow Creek. He stood, towering over Hank. But let me give you a little advice, officer. You don't want to make this your problem. Hank held his ground, though his hand tightened on his belt. I'm not asking, he said. Scar's eyes narrowed, his grin fading. For a moment, it seemed like he might push back. But then he stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Hank could hear. You've got no idea who you're messing with, kid. Walk away while you still can. Jim watched the exchange intently, his sharp eyes catching every movement, every shift in expression. He could see Hank's resolve waver slightly, but to his credit, the young deputy didn't back down. This is your last warning, Hank said, louder this time. Leave, or I'll have to escort you out. Scar chuckled, shaking his head. Fine. We're leaving. For now. He turned to his gang. Let's roll, boys. The bikers stood, their movements slow and deliberate as they made their way to the door. Scar paused as he passed Jim's table, his scarred face twisting into a smirk. See you around, Grandpa, he said. Jim didn't respond. He just watched as the bikers filed out, their laughter echoing in the parking lot as they mounted their bikes and roared away. The cafe let out a collective sigh of relief as the sound of the engines faded into the distance. Jenna set down the tray she had been holding, her hands still shaking. Ray leaned heavily against the counter, his face pale. Hank approached Jim, his expression a mix of frustration and gratitude. Thanks for staying calm, he said quietly. That could have gone south fast. Jim nodded, but his mind was already racing. He knew men like Scar didn't just leave. They regrouped, they plotted, and they came back. And when they did, they'd be more dangerous than ever. The bikers froze for a moment, their mocking laughter hanging awkwardly in the air. The cafe grew eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. Jim stood his ground, his gaze steady and unflinching. Scar, the leader, let out a low chuckle, his scar twisting as his smirk widened. You've got guts, old man. I'll give you that. But guts don't mean squat when you're outnumbered. His gang snickered, emboldened by their leader's confidence. The lanky one with the snake tattoo leaned against a nearby booth, picking at his nails with a pocket knife. What's the plan, Grandpa? You gonna throw your coffee at us? Jim didn't answer. He didn't need to. His calm, measured demeanor was answer enough. The tension in the room thickened, pressing down on everyone like a storm about to break. The young father, still clutching his daughter tightly, watched Jim with wide eyes. There was something about the older man's presence, something steady and unshakable, that gave him a glimmer of hope. Scar took another step closer, his boots thudding heavily on the wooden floor. Let me spell it out for you, he said, his voice low and menacing. This town belongs to us now. And anyone who's got a problem with that, he let the words hang, his meaning clear. Jim tilted his head slightly, his sharp eyes scanning Scar's face. This town doesn't belong to you. It never will. Scar's smirk faltered for a split second, but it returned just as quickly. You're not scared of me, are you, old man? No, Jim said simply. The bluntness of the response seemed to catch Scar off guard. His smirk twisted into a scowl. You really think you can stop us? Jim didn't reply. Instead, he reached into his pocket, and for a tense moment, everyone held their breath. But what he pulled out wasn't a weapon. It was a badge, worn and slightly tarnished, but still unmistakable. The room seemed to shift as the badge caught the light. It wasn't just any badge. It was the badge of a sheriff, the kind that commanded respect and carried authority. And suddenly, Jim wasn't just an old man anymore. The bikers stared at the badge, their bravado faltering. Scar's eyes narrowed, his mind racing as he processed what this meant. You're a cop, one of the bikers blurted out, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness. Was, Jim said, his tone calm but firm. Sheriff James Morgan. Retired. But I still know how to deal with trouble when I see it. The revelation sent a ripple through the room. The townsfolk exchanged glances, their fear giving way to a flicker of hope. They'd heard stories about Sheriff Morgan, stories of bravery, of a man who'd taken down dangerous criminals without breaking a sweat. Scar laughed, but it was forced, the sound brittle. Retired, huh? So that means you're just another civilian now. That badge doesn't mean anything anymore. Jim met Scar's gaze, his eyes sharp and unyielding. You're right. The badge doesn't mean anything. But I do. The cafe fell silent again, the weight of Jim's words settling over everyone. Even the bikers, who had been so full of confidence moments ago, seemed to hesitate. Scar's smirk returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. You think a washed-up sheriff is gonna scare us? You're outnumbered, old man. Jim didn't flinch. Maybe. But I've faced worse odds than this. The quiet confidence in his voice was enough to make even Scar pause. For the first time, the bikers seemed to realize that this wasn't just some frail old man they were dealing with. But Scar wasn't about to back down, not in front of his gang, not in front of the townsfolk. You think you're a hero, don't you? He sneered. Let's see how much of a hero you really are. He turned to his gang. Teach him a lesson. The bikers hesitated, their earlier bravado dampened by Jim's presence. But loyalty to their leader won out. Snake Tattoo was the first to step forward, his grin returning as he twirled his pocket knife. Time to see if you still got it, Sheriff, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Jim didn't move, didn't flinch. His steady gaze followed Snake Tattoo as the biker closed the distance between them. Careful, Jim said, his voice low but carrying weight. You don't want to do this. Snake Tattoo laughed, but it sounded nervous. Yeah? And why's that? Because if you take one more step, Jim said, his tone razor sharp, you'll regret it. Snake Tattoo hesitated, his grin faltering. But then he lunged, his knife aimed at Jim's chest. What happened next was so fast that most of the cafe's patrons didn't even see it. One moment, Snake Tattoo was charging forward. The next, he was on the ground, his knife skittering across the floor. Jim stood over him, calm and composed, his movements precise and efficient. It wasn't flashy, but it was effective, the kind of technique that came from years of training and experience. The other bikers stared in shock, their confidence evaporating. Even Scar seemed momentarily stunned. Snake Tattoo groaned, clutching his wrist as he glared up at Jim. You broke my wrist. Jim's expression didn't change. I warned you, he said simply. Scar's shock quickly turned to anger. He stepped forward, his fists clenched. "You've got a lot of nerve, old man," he growled. Jim met his gaze, his calm demeanor unshaken. "And you've got a lot of bad judgment. Walk away while you still can." Scar hesitated, his mind racing. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like Jim. But he also wasn't stupid. He could see that Jim wasn't bluffing. "You think this is over?" Scar said, his voice low and dangerous. "This is just the beginning." He motioned to his gang, and after a moment's hesitation, they began to retreat, their earlier bravado replaced with sullen silence. Scar paused at the door, turning back to Jim. "We'll be back," he said, his voice dripping with menace. Jim didn't respond. He just watched as the bikers filed out, their engines roaring to life in the parking lot. The cafe let out a collective breath as the sound of the bikes faded into the distance. Jenna sagged against the counter, her hands still shaking. Ray wiped his brow, his face pale. "Is it over?" Jenna asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jim didn't answer right away. He glanced at the badge in his hand, his fingers brushing over the worn surface. "Not yet," he said finally. The cafe seemed to breathe in unison as the roar of the bikes grew distant, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Eyes turned to Jim, a mix of awe and uncertainty on their faces. For the first time in a long while, the man they knew as just Jim wasn't just an unassuming regular at the cafe. He was something more, something that demanded respect. Jenna, still trembling, managed to step out from behind the counter. "Mr. Morgan," she began, her voice quivering, what are we going to do?" "They said they'd come back." Jim took a deep breath, slipping his badge back into his pocket. His face was calm, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the room and taking in the fear etched on every face. "We're not going to let fear run this town," he said firmly. "Not today. Not ever." Ray, the cafe owner, let out a shaky sigh as he came over to Jim. "Sheriff Jim, I appreciate what you did back there. But these guys, they're not like the trouble we've had before. They've been causing problems in every town they roll through. And they don't just stop at intimidation." Jim nodded, his expression thoughtful. He had already pieced together as much. Groups like this thrived on fear, escalating until they either got what they wanted or someone stood in their way. "They'll come back," Jim said, his voice steady. "But we'll be ready." The townsfolk exchanged uneasy glances. A middle-aged man near the back spoke up, his tone uncertain. "We're not fighters, Jim. What can we do against guys like that?" Jim's gaze swept the room, lingering on each face. "You don't have to fight them. That's my job. But we can't let them think they can just walk in here and do whatever they want. That starts with all of us standing together." The room fell silent again. Slowly, Jenna nodded, her youthful fear giving way to a flicker of determination. "He's right," she said. "This is our town. Why should we let them take it over?" Her words seemed to ignite something in the others. One by one, murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Even Ray, who had been wringing his hands nervously, straightened his shoulders. "All right, Jim," he said. "What's the plan?" Jim spent the next hour talking to the townsfolk, strategizing and reassuring them. He knew they weren't soldiers or officers, they were farmers, shopkeepers, and retirees. But they had something the bikers didn't, a reason to stand their ground. This was their home. He walked them through basic preparations, locking up valuables, keeping an eye out for strangers, and staying in touch with one another. He instructed Ray to keep the cafe's phone line open and called the neighboring county sheriff's office to give them a heads up. But as the townsfolk slowly dispersed, their nervous energy fading into tentative hope, Jim lingered behind. Something about Scar's parting words gnawed at him. The man had been angry, sure, but he'd also been calculating. He wasn't just blowing off steam, he had a plan. Jim sat back down at his corner table, his mind racing. He thought back to his days as sheriff, to the countless times he'd faced down men like Scar. The key wasn't just to react to their threats but to anticipate their next move. "Mind if I join you?" Jim looked up to see Jenna standing by his table, 2 steaming mugs of coffee in her hands. He gestured for her to sit, and she slid into the seat across from him, setting one of the mugs in front of him. "You think they'll come back tonight?" she asked quietly, her wide eyes searching his face for answers. Jim nodded. "Men like that don't wait long to make their point. They'll want to scare us into submission before we have time to organize." Jenna bit her lip, her fingers tightening around her mug. "And if they do?" Jim gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Then we remind them whose town this is." As night fell over Meadow Creek, Jim made his way home, his boots crunching on the gravel path leading to his modest house on the edge of town. He had only just stepped onto the porch when he noticed something unusual, a faint light flickering in the distance, coming from the old service road near the woods. He paused, his instincts kicking in. That road hadn't been used in years, not since the logging company shut down its operations. There shouldn't have been anyone out there. Grabbing a flashlight and a sturdy walking stick, one that conveniently doubled as a self-defense tool, Jim headed toward the light. The air was cool and still, the kind of quiet that made every rustle of leaves seem louder than it was. As he approached the source of the light, he spotted them, 2 of Scar's men, their bikes parked haphazardly on the side of the road. They were talking in hushed tones, their shadows dancing in the glow of a makeshift fire. Jim crouched low, staying just out of sight. He strained to catch snippets of their conversation. "Boss says we hit the diner first," one of them muttered, his voice gruff. "Make an example out of that old man." The other laughed, his tone laced with cruelty. "Can't wait to see the look on his face when we trash the place. He'll wish he kept his mouth shut." Jim's jaw tightened. So they were planning to escalate, just as he'd suspected. But he also caught something else in their conversation, a reference to a larger group waiting at an abandoned barn just outside town. Satisfied that he'd heard enough, Jim retreated the way he came, careful not to make a sound. By the time he reached his porch again, his mind was racing with possibilities. He couldn't wait for Scar and his gang to make their move. He had to take the fight to them. The next morning, Jim called an emergency meeting at the cafe. The townsfolk trickled in, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. "What's this about, Jim?" Ray asked as he poured coffee for the gathering crowd. Jim stood at the front of the room, his hands resting on the back of a chair. "They're coming back," he said without preamble. "And they're planning to cause more than just trouble this time." A ripple of unease spread through the room. "But we're not going to let them," Jim continued, his voice firm. "I scouted their meeting spot last night. They're holed up at the old barn on Miller's Road, planning their next move. We have the advantage, we know where they are, and we know what they're planning. That means we can stop them before they bring their fight to us." "How?" someone asked. "We're not exactly equipped to take on a gang." Jim nodded. "You're right. And I'm not asking anyone here to put themselves in harm's way. But if we work together, we can send a message they won't forget." He outlined his plan, keeping it simple but effective. The townsfolk would set up barricades on the main road into town, forcing the bikers to detour and slow down. Meanwhile, Jim would pay the barn a visit alone. The room erupted in protest. "You can't go by yourself!" Jenna exclaimed. "I can," Jim said calmly. "And I will. Trust me, I've handled worse." The cafe erupted into chaos as the bikers, now realizing they had underestimated their opponent, exchanged panicked glances. The leader, Scar, straightened, his face twisted in fury and disbelief. "I don't care who you used to be, old man," he spat, his voice laced with venom. "You're just one guy. You think you can take all of us?" Jim's eyes narrowed. He didn't flinch. "I've taken down worse than you in my time," he replied evenly, his calm tone cutting through the tension like a blade. "And I'm still standing. You're just bullies on bikes." Scar's face darkened, his pride stung. He motioned to the remaining gang members, and they fanned out, surrounding Jim. The cafe patrons gasped, some ducking behind counters, while others watched with a mix of fear and awe. One of the bikers charged first, a reckless swing of a crowbar aimed at Jim's side. With a quick pivot, Jim stepped inside the arc of the swing, grabbing the man's wrist and slamming his forearm down onto the counter. The biker let out a cry of pain as the crowbar clattered to the floor. Before the others could react, another came at Jim from the side, fists raised. Jim moved like a seasoned fighter, ducking the punch and driving his elbow into the man's ribs. The air left the biker in a harsh grunt as he collapsed to his knees. Scar barked orders to his men. "Take him down. Now." Two bikers lunged at Jim simultaneously, their brute force clearly meant to overwhelm him. Jim sidestepped the first, using the man's momentum to send him crashing into a table. The second grabbed Jim's arm, but Jim twisted free and countered with a precise strike to the man's jaw, dropping him instantly. Scar stood back, watching with a growing sense of dread. His crew was falling like dominoes, and this old man hadn't even broken a sweat. As the last of the bikers hesitated, unsure whether to press the attack, Jim reached into his pocket and pulled out the sheriff's badge. He held it up for all to see, the polished metal catching the light. "I've dealt with your kind my whole career," Jim said, his voice steady and commanding. "You think you can scare people into submission? Push them around because you're louder and meaner? Not here. Not in my town." Scar's bravado faltered. He clenched his fists, but the cracks in his confidence were evident. "So what if you're some washed-up sheriff?" he sneered, though his voice wavered. "You're not the law anymore." Jim stepped closer, his towering presence forcing Scar to take a half step back. "You're right," Jim said. "I'm not the law anymore. But I still stand for it. And I won't let thugs like you think they can terrorize innocent people." He turned to the cafe patrons, his voice rising. "This isn't just about me. This is about all of us. This town doesn't belong to them, it belongs to us. And together, we're stronger than any gang of bullies." The words seemed to light a fire in the room. Jenna, still trembling but resolute, stepped out from behind the counter. Ray picked up a chair, his face set in determination. Even the older patrons, who had initially cowered, now stood a little taller. The bikers looked around, realizing the tide had turned. They weren't just facing one man anymore, they were facing an entire town. Scar wasn't ready to back down. He pulled a knife from his belt, his face a mask of rage. "You think you've won? I'll show you what happens when you cross me." Jim didn't flinch. He kept his eyes locked on Scar, his hands steady. "Don't do it," he warned, his voice calm but firm. "You don't want to cross that line." Scar lunged, the blade flashing in the air. But Jim was faster. With a practiced move, he caught Scar's wrist, twisting it until the knife fell to the ground. In one fluid motion, Jim swept Scar's legs out from under him, sending the gang leader sprawling onto his back. Jim stood over him, his expression stern. "It's over," he said. Scar glared up at him, breathing hard. He opened his mouth to retort, but before he could, the sound of sirens filled the air. The cavalry had arrived. The cafe doors burst open, and uniformed officers flooded the room. Jim had called the neighboring county sheriff's office earlier, tipping them off about the gang's location and intentions. The bikers were rounded up one by one, their protests drowned out by the clinking of handcuffs. Scar was the last to be hauled to his feet. As he was led away, he turned to Jim, his face twisted in fury. "This isn't over," he snarled. Jim met his glare with unwavering calm. "It is for you," he said. As the police cars pulled away, the cafe erupted in applause. The townsfolk cheered, their fear replaced by relief and pride. Jenna ran up to Jim, throwing her arms around him in a grateful hug. "You did it," she said, her voice full of admiration. Jim shook his head. "We did it," he corrected. "This town stood up for itself today. That's what really matters." The cafe buzzed with renewed energy as the townsfolk shared their stories and marveled at Jim's heroics. But Jim, ever the modest man, quietly slipped back to his corner table, picking up his coffee as if nothing had happened. Ray approached him, a grateful smile on his face. "You're more than welcome to free coffee for life," he said. Jim chuckled. "I might take you up on that." As the sun set over Meadow Creek, the town felt different, stronger, united. And while Jim Morgan might have been retired, everyone knew the truth: their sheriff was still watching over them. And as for Jim, he sipped his coffee, content in the knowledge that peace, though fragile, had been restored for now. As the police cars disappeared down the road, Scar and his crew simmered in the back seat of a cruiser. But their fury wasn't spent. Scar's mind raced, already plotting his revenge. This wasn't just about losing, it was personal now. Hours later, as the cafe returned to normal and the adrenaline of the townsfolk began to fade, the bikers made their move. Scar, now out on bail thanks to some shady connections, rounded up his gang at a remote location just outside Meadow Creek. "This isn't over," Scar growled, slamming his fist on the table in the dimly lit bar they had regrouped in. His crew looked uneasy, they'd tasted Jim's strength and precision firsthand. But Scar's pride left no room for retreat. "He's just one man," Scar continued, his voice rising. "We're 7 strong. And this time, we don't play fair." Back in Meadow Creek, word of the bikers' release spread like wildfire. Jenna, Ray, and the others from the cafe exchanged nervous glances as they locked doors and closed early that evening. It felt like the calm before another storm. Jim, however, remained unshaken. He spent the afternoon walking through town, talking to the locals, reminding them to stay calm but prepared. The sheriff's badge stayed in his pocket, but his presence alone was enough to instill confidence. "Think they'll come back?" Ray asked nervously as Jim stopped by the cafe. "They will," Jim said simply. "But this time, we'll be ready." Jim had no intention of letting the bikers catch the town off guard. That evening, he called a meeting at the community center, gathering a mix of familiar faces and some unexpected ones. "This isn't just my fight," Jim said, addressing the room. "This town has always stood together. That's why Meadow Creek is special. These men think they can scare us into submission. But I've seen what you're all made of. You've got more courage than they'll ever understand." The group nodded in agreement. Jenna spoke up, her voice stronger now. "What do we do?" Jim laid out his plan, each detail carefully thought out. The townsfolk weren't fighters, but they didn't have to be. With Jim's guidance, they prepared defenses, set up lookouts, and coordinated a strategy to keep the bikers contained if they returned. The bikers arrived after sundown, their engines roaring as they tore down Main Street. It was clear they meant business this time. Scar led the pack, his scarred face twisted in a determined snarl. Lights flickered on in the town's windows, but no one stepped outside. The street seemed deserted, the perfect setup for the ambush Jim had planned. As the bikers parked in front of the cafe, Scar shouted into the night. "Come on out, old man. Let's finish this." The doors of the cafe swung open, and Jim stepped out, his silhouette calm against the warm light inside. He didn't look afraid. In fact, he looked ready. "Scar," Jim said, his voice cutting through the night, "you've already lost. Don't make this worse for yourself." Scar laughed, but the sound carried a hint of unease. You think a little speech is gonna stop me? Before he could continue, the sound of footsteps echoed from the shadows. Townsfolk appeared on either side of the street, armed with makeshift defenses, bats, tools, and anything they could find. Scar's gang hesitated, their bravado faltering as the realization hit, they were outnumbered. "Walk away," Jim said, taking a step closer. "You've got no power here. You never did." But Scar, stubborn and seething, made one last attempt to intimidate. He reached for a chain on his bike, swinging it threateningly. "I'll show you who's got the power." Scar charged, the chain whistling through the air as he swung it toward Jim. But Jim had been waiting for this moment. With a swift movement, he caught the chain mid-swing, yanking it hard enough to send Scar stumbling forward. In the same motion, Jim delivered a precise strike to Scar's midsection, doubling him over. The chain clattered to the ground as Scar collapsed to his knees, wheezing. The rest of the bikers froze, unsure whether to step in or retreat. The townsfolk, emboldened by Jim's confidence, advanced a step closer, their makeshift weapons at the ready. "This is your last chance," Jim said, his voice calm but commanding. "Leave now, and don't come back." Scar looked up at him, his face twisted in anger and pain. But even he could see the writing on the wall. "Let's go," he muttered, struggling to his feet. As the bikers mounted their bikes and roared away into the night, a collective cheer erupted from the townsfolk. They had stood up to their tormentors and won not just because of Jim, but because they had come together as a community. Jenna hugged Jim tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. Jim patted her on the back, a rare smile crossing his face. "You all did this," he said. "I just reminded you what you're capable of." The night ended with laughter and relief, the people of Meadow Creek knowing they had reclaimed their peace. Jim sat alone at the cafe the next morning, sipping his coffee as the sun rose over the town. The badge lay on the table beside him, a quiet reminder of who he was and who he still could be when the moment called for it. Jenna approached with a fresh pot of coffee, pouring him another cup. "You're a hero, you know," she said. Jim shook his head. "I'm just a man who loves his town," he replied. "And that's all the reason I need." As the cafe filled with the sounds of morning chatter and the smell of fresh coffee, Jim allowed himself a moment of quiet pride. Meadow Creek was safe again, and while peace was fragile, he knew it was worth fighting for. And if trouble ever came knocking again, they all knew who to call. As the sound of the bikers' engines faded into the distance, a heavy silence fell over the cafe. The townsfolk, still on edge, slowly began to relax. The threat that had hung over them for what felt like hours was finally gone, but the air was still thick with relief and disbelief. Jim stood in the doorway of the cafe, his presence as calm and steady as ever. His eyes scanned the room, watching the people he'd known for years slowly return to their seats. It was like the storm had passed, and they were beginning to realize that everything was going to be okay. But Jim wasn't so sure. The bikers had left, but it wasn't the end. He knew how quickly things could change in a small town, how easily a new threat could rise in the wake of this one. The young waitress, still shaken by the events of the day, hesitated before walking over to Jim. Her hands were trembling as she approached, her face a mix of gratitude and fear. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "I didn't know what to do, you saved us." Jim nodded slowly, his eyes softening just slightly. "You did your part too," he said, his voice steady but kind. "You stayed calm. That matters more than you think." He gave her a small, reassuring smile. She nodded, still too shaken to speak. As she turned to leave, she paused and glanced back at him, her eyes wide with gratitude. Jim knew the effect he had on people. But this was more than just saving the day, it was about showing them that there was always a way to stand up, even when it seemed impossible. The cafe owner, a tall man named Ray, walked over to Jim with a look of appreciation in his eyes. Ray had been behind the counter, watching everything unfold, and his jaw had clenched at the sight of the bikers pushing everyone around. Jim had watched the entire scene unfold through the eyes of a man who knew just how much the town had been through. He had seen towns like this crumble under the weight of fear. But not Meadow Creek. Not this time. "Jim, you're a hero," Ray said, his voice full of respect. "I don't know how to thank you. Please, let me give you a free meal. It's the least I can do." Jim shook his head, his expression unchanged. "Thanks, Ray, but I'm good. You keep the place running, and we're all good. It's not about a meal, it's about keeping things in balance. You all did just fine tonight." Ray opened his mouth to insist, but Jim held up a hand. He didn't want the attention. There were no grand gestures in Jim's mind. It was about protecting the peace and moving on. The cafe buzzed with the sound of small conversations starting up again, but there was a sense of renewed confidence. The fear that had once settled over the room had lifted, replaced by something stronger, a quiet strength that came from knowing they had survived. The night wore on, and the crowd began to thin as the evening rolled into night. But Jim couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lingering in the air. The bikers had left, but there was no way to know for sure whether they'd try to return. He couldn't ignore the reality that trouble often returned, sometimes in unexpected forms. Jim walked slowly outside, taking in the night air. It was a peaceful evening, with stars twinkling overhead and the cool breeze brushing against his face. It was easy to forget that just hours ago, the cafe had been filled with tension, fear, and chaos. But that was how things went, Jim knew. Life in small towns like Meadow Creek wasn't always peaceful. It could be easy to fall into a rhythm of believing that peace was just the default state. It wasn't. It had to be fought for. Protected. As he walked down the sidewalk, he noticed a few of the townsfolk still lingering, talking amongst themselves in small groups. Jim nodded at them as he passed by, his hand resting lightly on his hip where his badge still tucked inside his jacket. The weight of it wasn't as heavy as it used to be, but it was still there, a reminder of the years he had spent serving as sheriff. It was a reminder of the kind of man he had been and the kind of man he still was. The cafe was now quiet, and Jim knew it was time for him to leave. As he turned the corner toward the small house he'd lived in for years, he saw Ray's wife out front, sweeping the porch. She waved at him and he waved back, nodding politely. Inside his home, Jim settled into his favorite chair, the one by the window. The sun would rise soon, and when it did, the world would return to its routine. But tonight, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. He thought back to the days when he was sheriff, when his name was known all over the county, when his reputation struck fear in the hearts of criminals. Those were different times, times when the world felt a little bit more dangerous. But the world was changing, and so was he. Maybe he wasn't as sharp as he used to be, and maybe he didn't move as fast as he once did. But Jim knew one thing: some things never changed. The people of Meadow Creek were his people. He had protected them for years, and even though he had hung up his badge, the fire to protect them was still there. The bikers had come for the wrong town, and they had learned that lesson the hard way. The next morning, the town woke to a fresh day. The sun bathed the streets in light, and there was a calm that felt earned. The gossip about the night before spread quickly, but the story wasn't one of fear, it was one of resilience. People who had been too frightened to stand up before now walked a little taller. They knew they could face whatever came next. Jim was at the cafe early, his usual spot by the window waiting for him. He didn't need to say much. The others had already made up their minds about what had happened, and they had their own stories to tell. They had their own victories, their own lessons learned. "Jim," Jenna said as she placed a steaming cup of coffee in front of him, "there's something I've been meaning to ask." Jim looked up, his brow slightly raised. "What's that?" You ever think about coming back? Jenna asked softly. You'd be a hell of a sheriff still. I mean, you showed us all last night what it really means to protect the town. Jim took a slow sip of his coffee, looking out the window. I'm not sure I'm cut out for that life anymore, he said. But if the town ever needs me again, I won't hesitate. Jenna smiled, satisfied with the answer. I think we'll all sleep a little easier tonight knowing that. Jim sat back in his chair, the weight of the badge still with him, but not burdened by it. The town was safe again. That was enough. And sometimes, that was all that mattered. The morning sun was just beginning to climb over the horizon, casting a warm golden light over the small town of Meadow Creek. Jim stepped out of the cafe, his boots scraping lightly against the pavement. For a moment, the light hit his badge, making it shine brightly, a brief flash of something more than just an old piece of metal. It was a symbol of who he had been, of the years he had dedicated to this town, and the quiet strength that had always been there, just waiting for the right moment to rise. But Jim didn't linger on the thought. He slipped the badge back into his pocket and walked toward his truck. His pace was slow, measured, as though he had all the time in the world. The engine rumbled to life, and he pulled out of the parking lot, heading toward the outskirts of town. As he drove, Jim glanced in the rearview mirror, watching the town fade into the distance. The people he had protected, the faces he had known for years, would carry on. The cafe would open again tomorrow, the same as it always did. But something had changed. It wasn't the kind of change you could see right away, but Jim knew it was there. He knew that the people of Meadow Creek had learned something important, that strength didn't always look the way they thought it would. As the truck bumped down the dusty road leading out of town, Jim allowed himself to reflect on the events of the last day. It had been a simple thing, really. A few rough bikers had come into town, pushed the wrong people, and ended up learning a lesson. But there was more to it than that. Jim had never been the kind of man to brag or show off. He'd never needed to. His power wasn't in his size, or the force of his voice, or the number of badges he wore. His power had always been in his quiet resolve, in the way he approached every challenge with a calm confidence that made people stop and think. He didn't need to prove anything. He just did what needed to be done. And maybe that was the lesson for everyone else. The town, the bikers, and even Jim himself. Power wasn't about the loudest voice in the room or the biggest display of strength. It was about standing firm in the face of adversity, about doing what was right even when it wasn't easy. It was about knowing when to step forward and when to let your actions speak louder than words. Jim had learned that long ago, during his years as sheriff. He had seen plenty of tough guys, criminals who thought they could intimidate the world. But he knew that real strength didn't come from trying to force people to bow to your will. It came from having the courage to do what was right, even if no one else was watching. As the truck bumped along the road, Jim thought about the young waitress from the cafe. She had been scared at first, unsure of what to do when the bikers started causing trouble. But she hadn't run away. She had stayed calm, done her job, and helped keep the peace in whatever way she could. And in the end, that had made all the difference. She wasn't a fighter, not like Jim had been in his prime. But she had a strength of her own, a quiet kind of courage that mattered just as much. Jim smiled to himself as he thought of her. She had been the first to thank him, and she had been right to do so. He had saved them, but only because they had stood together. That was the real power of a community, a shared strength, a collective will to protect each other when it mattered most. His thoughts shifted as he turned the truck onto the winding road that led out of Meadow Creek. There was something satisfying about the stillness of the countryside, the way the world seemed to slow down outside of town. In the city, everything moved so fast, so loudly. But here, life took its time. It had a rhythm that was calming and simple. The truck rattled over the gravel road, and Jim's hands gripped the steering wheel, his eyes on the open road ahead. He didn't know what the future held for Meadow Creek. He didn't know if there would be more trouble, or if there would be more bikers, or more people who thought they could push around the quiet townsfolk. What he did know was that the people in that cafe would remember. They would remember the lesson that the quietest person in the room could hold the most power. And it wasn't just about the bikers or the cafe, it was about life itself. So many people go through life thinking they're too small, too quiet, too unimportant. But that's not the truth. The truth is, everyone has a strength inside them. It might be hidden, or it might take time to find, but it's there. And when it counts, when it matters most, it will come out. Jim had always known that, even when he was younger, even when he was wearing a badge and chasing down criminals. The real power, he knew, wasn't in force. It was in standing tall, staying calm, and doing what was right. It was in understanding that no matter how quiet you were, no matter how unassuming, you could still change the world around you. And that was something the bikers would never forget. They had underestimated the people of Meadow Creek, especially the quiet, retired sheriff. They had thought they could just walk in, push people around, and leave without consequence. But they had learned, in the hardest way possible, that you can never be too sure of who you're messing with. You never know who might stand up when it matters. As Jim's truck grew smaller in the distance, the sun rose higher in the sky, bathing Meadow Creek in its soft light. The town would go on. The cafe would open again. But now, there was something different in the air. Something stronger. And the people of Meadow Creek would carry that with them from now on. They would remember that strength doesn't always shout, it can be quiet, humble, and steady. But it is no less powerful for that. And sometimes, when the world tries to push you down, all it takes is one quiet person to stand up, and the rest will follow. That was the lesson Jim had taught them. And it was a lesson they would never forget. As he drove farther from town, Jim allowed himself one last glance in the rearview mirror. Meadow Creek was still there, the town he had sworn to protect. And he knew, deep down, that it always would be, because sometimes, the quietest person in the room holds the most power. And those who underestimate that will learn the hard way. The sun shone brightly ahead, and Jim Morgan, retired sheriff, drove on into the day, knowing that the people he'd protected had learned the most important lesson of all.